Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
So we're going to get started. Today, Kirill is not here as my co-host. I'm going to be hosting this on my own. My name's Mary Neuberger. I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, and I'm a professor of history here at the University of Texas at Austin. So welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. I'm really excited about our speaker today. Today we have Vladimir Kulić, who's an architectural historian, curator, and associate professor, and the David Lingle Faculty Fellow, the Department of Architecture at Iowa State University. He is the co-curator of the exhibitions Toward a Concrete Utopia, Architecture in Yugoslavia, 1948 through 1980, which is at Museum of Modern Art in New York, ran from 2018 to 2019. Also, Unfinished Modernizations between Utopia and Pragmatism, which has been at various institutions between 2012 and 2014. He's also written numerous journal articles, co-authored and edited 7 books, including, that's a lot. How did you do all that? Including
collaboration.
Yes, it helps. Including Second World Postmodernisms, Architecture and Society Under Late Socialism, and Modernism In-Between, the Mediatory Architecture of Socialist Yugoslavia. Vladimir is also the winner of several awards, including the Exhibition Catalog Award from the Society of Architectural Historians, which was in 2021, and the Richard Schlagman Art Book Award from the Whitechapel Gallery in London in 2019, as well as the Bruno Zevi Prize for Historical Critical Essay in Architecture from 2010. He is the recipient of numerous grants and fellowships, including those from the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, the American Academy in Berlin, the Center for Advanced Studies in the Visual Art, the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the Graham Foundation. And one last thing, Vladimir received his PhD here at the University of Texas at Austin, so we're proud of him as our own alumni. And his advisor, his primary advisor, is here today with us, Christopher Long, so he gets, no? He's
Danilo,
shaking.
Danilo was officially.
Oh, Danilo, oh, sorry, and he's here.
I was number 2.
Well, then we also have his primary advisor is here, Danilo Udovici-Selb, who I don't see, but as I hear is here, and his secondary advisor, Christopher Long. So we're all really excited for your talk today, Vladimir. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mary, for this very generous introduction. Thank you also to both you and Kirill for inviting me. It's I probably don't need to say that how much of a pleasure it is to be back to Austin, even if virtually, and see all the familiar faces, and be in a way back to my alma mater where I started a very long time ago. But it's also a special pleasure because this semester is my 20th anniversary since I arrived in Austin, in the United States. So it's kind of especially meaningful. And one thing that Mary did not mention is that she was also on my dissertation committee. So that's also worth mentioning as well. And it was part of her of an early iteration of the Balkan Circle, right, or the reading group, right, that you started while I was still a graduate student. So there's that important connection. So I'm very happy to see everyone, and to see both my professors as well as former students. Hello, Stefka, again. Stefka was my student in Florida. To see other colleagues as well. Hello to Vladislav, whom I think I saw in the audience as well, and everyone else. Thank you very much for coming. So, considering the the day, right? This kind of anniversary, and today especially because I just, as I just explained, I'm just coming from a school where I was introduced to the donor of the faculty fellowship that I just received. It feels a little bit introspective, right? Talking in Austin after coming there for 20 years. So I thought maybe I should start with that, explaining why I came to Austin 2 decades ago. I was already at the time teaching at the University of Belgrade. It was at the turn of the millennium. I imagine most of you will know the events that occurred in the Balkans, in the former Yugoslavia, with the collapse of the country in the 1990s. That was also the time when I graduated from college, started teaching at the university, and started noticing this tremendous transformation of the urban environment that was going on, obviously for political and economic and ideological reasons. And that got me into thinking about this distinctly unfashionable architecture that was around me, that was being universally condemned at the time, both in Yugoslavia, but also still internationally. Architecture that at the time was really subjected even to physical destruction, right, through the war or through the various wars that occurred in the region for the entire decade. And I thought that would be a really interesting topic to study, which in long term proved to be a good idea, but in short term was not such a great idea, because when I came to the States, it was how do I put it? It was not just unfashionable, but it caused so many blank stares when I mentioned what I was talking about, that I think it was in some ways a hindrance in the wider sense. I think that at the time there were basically 3 of us in the entire United States, 3 graduate students working on post-war Eastern Europe. My friend Kimberly Zerekor, who teaches here, right, and Juliana Maxim, who's now in San Diego, and that's about all. And we got to know each other very quickly. In a way, I'm going to talk about the MoMA exhibition as a vehicle to highlight perhaps the change that occurred in the meantime, in the past 20 years, right? MoMA show was obviously the major turning point that in some ways facilitated a profound change in reception of the period. But it was not, the road to MoMA was actually quite long. So I would like to give you a little bit of a background in that respect, and then try to highlight the logic that we try to apply when conceptualizing the exhibition, some of the difficulties that we encounter, the message that we try to communicate, etc. So my reasons for studying Yugoslavia were twofold. On the one hand, Yugoslavia seemed like a really compelling example for the relationship between architecture and politics. This was a relatively easy case to make because of the country's geopolitical liminal position during the Cold War. As you probably all know, it straddled the geopolitical divide between socialist East and capitalist West, but also made extensive connections with the post-colonial South. So on one hand, I believe that architecture in Yugoslavia was an excellent case study for this shifting relationship between politics and ideology on the one hand, and the discipline, the profession on the other. At the same time, however, I also believe that architecture produced in Yugoslavia was of an exceptional quality, and that it deserved its place on what we might call the global map of modernism, right? That it deserves to be known more broadly. This was at the time a bit of a half-baked idea, but I did think that there was some interest, some value to that claim, even though local architecture history never posited in that way, right? Local architecture history always was written in relation to established international signposts, right? Oh, this building is, resembles, I don't know, Mies van der Rohe or Le Corbusier or Louis Kahn or whatever. And that theoretical and historical self-consciousness about the actual achievement was not quite there. But because there's so many people in the audience who are not architecture historians, I also think it's worth pointing out that from its kind of a founding, the discipline of architecture history has a little bit of a schizophrenic nature, right? Because on the one hand, it originates in the efforts to celebrate and make operative the knowledge of Greek and Roman antiquity, right? To learn from Greek and Roman antiquity as a supposed origins of so-called Western civilization. So architecture history has, for the past 300 years or so, had the role of canonizing what's valuable, right? Selecting among the entire built environments, right, of the world, what matters as monuments, as buildings to know and to learn from. And there is the famous claim by Nicholas Pevsner, a famed German-British architecture historian, who once said back in the 50s, and I quote, "A bicycle shed is a building, Lincoln Cathedral is a piece of architecture," right? So bicycle sheds are not worth studying. It's the aesthetic achievements, exceptional aesthetic achievements that are worth studying. Of course, the situation has changed. First, with the onset of modernism and the change in the social orientation of architecture, but especially in the past couple of decades, the discipline of architecture history has moved far beyond this, has started questioning the canon, right, or whatever that idea of the canon might be, expanding the canon, arguing that there's a lot more architecture worth studying that was never included, that architecture that was worth studied maybe was not so great as we thought. Maybe, there might be reasons why it's also very problematic. And in a way, the discipline itself, in its own disciplinary core, obviously is now aiming at something different. But the strange institutional position of architecture history is that it's at architecture schools where there's still the expectation that you're going to teach students models to be learned from, right? So there's this duality that's built into the profession that I think in many ways reflected on my own motivations for engaging in the study of Yugoslavia. So the safe way, actually, in disciplinary terms, was to explore this role of architecture in the wider social framework. And my dissertation at UT was about architecture and the state in socialist Yugoslavia. And that's, I think, there is a good claim to make that this was a really interesting case study. But I was always also very much tempted to make the other claim, right? That there was an architectural value to the architecture that I studied. was a lot more reluctant to make that claim openly. And when I did, I very often received pushback saying, "Oh, that's not very, very special. You should, compare this to something else. There's, this is nothing interesting." But as I went along and kind of matured as a scholar, I'm actually, as we go, learning how to make that claim. And in the really interesting twist, right, in my efforts as a scholar, it was this effort to put Yugoslavia on the map for the value of architecture that kind of succeeded beyond my wildest expectations, whereas this more scholarly approach perhaps kind of ended up a little bit in the background. So I'd say an interesting contradiction. I think that's worth thinking about in disciplinary terms for everyone who's studying architecture history, but also very much art history. I think it's applicable to art, to literature, etc. Maybe I should start finally sharing my PowerPoint. I hope you can see the screen, right? And the
yes, we can. Yeah.
PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Let me just get a handle of this because Zoom is making it a little bit complicated to handle. Okay, I have to be careful about touching anything on the computer because I try to switch things around because the Zoom interface covers most of my screen, so I'm not totally sure what I'm showing, but hopefully you get to see you see the title slide, right, with the title of the exhibition. Okay, so when I entered the PhD program at UT, there were two widespread stereotypes about the architecture of Eastern Europe and the architecture of the former socialist world, and they were replicated so adamantly that it was very difficult to make any challenges to them. And one, of course, is the early Cold War stereotype of socialist realist megalomania, right? The Stalinist monumentalism. You see on the left the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. And the other one is the stereotype of the bland, drab, endlessly monotonous, prefabricated residential blocks, the microrayons that superseded the previous one of Stalinist socialist realism. That was not the image that I had, right, coming from a formerly socialist country. My idea of the architecture that was produced as I was growing up was quite different, and yet these established ideas were pretty difficult to challenge. Interestingly, by the time I finished my dissertation, by the late 2000s, a third stereotype started emerging through the agency of popular publishers, artists, photographers, and others who started discovering Eastern Europe and discovering the architecture that was not previously widely shared in the media, very often termed brutalist. you see one of the early books that launched this interest by a French photographer, Frederic Chopin, who photographed late Soviet buildings across the former Soviet Union and labeled them in a very interesting way, right? You see the title is CCCP, which is supposed to allude to Cyrillic USSR, but CCCP stands for Cosmic Communist Constructions Photographed. And this trope of cosmic, of alien, of something that is sort of unrelated to even the earth or any kind of human culture is something that became very much replicated at the time, much to my dismay and dismay of colleagues and friends who have been working on this topic for a while. This was also the time when global interest in brutalism re-emerged. I just had the conversation at school with some colleagues about these kind of cycles, about the waves of interest, about sort of dismissal and rediscovery of various historical periods. And sometime around 2010, the architecture of the 50s and the 60s, that's typically labeled brutalism for its exposed concrete surfaces, started slowly finding its way into the media, on the social networks, etc. I want to argue that there was also a certain degree of nostalgia, not just for the period for its aesthetic qualities, but also for the social purpose of this architecture. But even in the West, this was the architecture of the West, of the welfare state, that became largely that disappeared, right? And this interest in brutalism, I want to argue, was sort of a symptom of this political nostalgia for a time, for a safer time of social mobility, when society took some, whether East and West took some responsibility for its the good of its population. So the motivations for this rediscovery of Eastern Europe were sort of multiple, but it took a while for them to sort of coalesce and merge into some kind of more meaningful argument. This initial wave of interest in Eastern Europe and Yugoslavia as part of Eastern Europe quickly mushroomed into a tremendous amount of books, some of which you see on the screen, but also various internet platforms, social media groups, Facebook groups, etc. And they were largely mediated through photography, which in some ways flattened architecture to dimensional representation, right? Erasing precisely what I just tried to argue about the social commitment. And some of the interpretations that emerged attached to these projects ended up being hugely problematic. There was, I argued this in an article a couple of years ago, that this was a new form of Orientalism, where Western artists, typically photographers, sort of assumed that the role of 19th century Orientalist discoverers and funded by wealthy galleries and donors in the West, went on a kind of safari of Eastern Europe to discover this supposedly neglected or dilapidated architecture, and then of course framed it in their own way, right? Framed it in the only way that they could frame it, right? With the kind of this residue of the totalitarian paradigm that came from the Cold War, and perhaps an especially problematic case in this respect was the work of the Belgian photographer Jan Kempenaars, whose book cover you see at the very top. It's called. He was the one who launched the term spomenik, which is Serbo-Croatian and Slovenian Macedonian. It kind of cuts all the way across word for the monument. But he never translated that as a way of kind of ascribing certain exoticism to anti-fascist monuments that were built all over former Yugoslavia. And the images themselves are beautiful, but they were completely disembodied from the histories that they were meant to commemorate. They were authorship was never ascribed, geographical position was never ascribed, and especially offensive was the conclusion written by a Dutch architect who very explicitly inscribed these monuments into the totalitarian paradigm, and ultimately claimed that, like Terragni's Casa del Fascio, which became a valuable piece of modernist architecture only when it became detached from the fascist regime that produced it. These monuments will become valuable as architecture only when they are detached from their original purpose, right? That was created under socialism, which is a mind-bogglingly problematic statement because pretty much the entire book is about monuments to anti-fascist struggle and the victims of fascism, and many of the sites that Kempenaars photographed were monuments to mass atrocities, to concentration camps, or atrocities against civilians. So to claim that emptying out the meaning from this monument, to see them as pure form, is somehow desirable, was a really hugely problematic turn. That eventually made it possible for these monuments to become commercialized. Here we see, I think this is a New Zealandese band that sells its fan T-shirts with the cover of Petrova Gora monument. This is a project by a British photographer who celebrates parkour athletes running over monuments. And all of the monuments that you see here are monuments to mass atrocities. The one to the right is at Jasenovac concentration camp, the worst concentration camp in the Balkans in World War II. And ultimately, that made it possible in 2018 for Jasenovac to become the site of an advertising campaign of an Australian sunglass company that came to the former Yugoslavia, I think Bulgaria as well, and used these monuments as backdrops to sell sunglasses, right? So, you know, it's kind of a very facile connection, right? Black zero, black sunglasses, and their black history. And of course, this finally provoked a mass reaction, right? Ultimately, even the World Jewish Congress was involved and had to finally withdraw the campaign. So in some ways, this was sort of the climate in which we entered when we started working on the exhibition at the MoMA. Of course, this entire phenomenon irked a lot of people, especially people like myself and many of my colleagues and friends with whom I had worked already by that time for quite a while, because of all of these problematic connotations, and also for overlooking by that time a substantial amount of actual scholarship that looked at architecture of the socialist world, former Yugoslavia. In particular, Mary mentioned at the beginning the exhibition Unfinished Modernizations that I co-curated. This was a project that I started with my friend Mare Mrduljaš from Zagreb. Literally a month after I defended the dissertation, I went back home thinking that I was going to finally take a rest, and I received a phone call from the Association of Croatian Architects asking me if I would be interested in developing a proposal for the European Commission for some kind of collaborative project across the former Yugoslavia. And Mara and I came up with this idea of re-evaluating former Yugoslav architecture historically, but also trying to look at the current transformations of architecture at the time. We wrote the proposal, never thinking that it would get very far, and then finally we got the funding and ended up in this 2-year-long project with some 30-something colleagues from all over the former country producing this exhibition. What turned out as we worked on it was that the interest in this neglected and erased history greatly outweighed the interest in the current transformation. So in some ways, this exhibition ended up being a precursor of the MoMA show, in the sense that it studied the architecture of the former socialist world from many different angles, and uncovered many figures that were neglected, and also allowed us to build network of people interested in the topic, that continued and still continues working on it to this day. This is the exhibition eventually ended up traveling for 2 years to some 12 destinations. It was shown a couple of times in Slovenia, a couple of times in Croatia. It was in Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia. It never made it to Kosovo, but it made it to Albania. It was even shown in Tirana. And in some ways, it sort of helped the architectural profession reevaluate its own past. The architectural profession in the region, right, in the former Yugoslavia, evaluate its own past, and in some ways bring the consciousness, the value of the consciousness of its value back into discussion. The product was the catalog that you see on the right, but at the same time, Mara and I worked together on our own photographic monograph with our friend Wolfgang Thaler, the Austrian photographer. So we produced this other book that you see on the left, Modernism In-Between, which was lavishly illustrated with Wolfgang's really beautiful new photos. But unlike those previous photographic books coffee table books that I showed you, we actually try to buttress the images with some serious text. So this book came out 3 years after I defended the dissertation, but it was pretty much written from scratch. I obviously cannibalized much of my own research for it, but it ended up being kind of a completely different text with a different argument, and geared more towards the architectural profession to make the claim for the value of the architecture that we studied. I thought then, when the books came out, that finally I can now go back and work on on transforming my dissertation into a book. By that time, the topic sort of coalesced towards the idea of geopolitics and studying the geopolitical mobilization of architecture in socialist Yugoslavia. I went on another round of research, archival research throughout the region, discovered many even more fascinating case studies than I thought I had before. And then I received this email that you would never, you can never expect, you can never plan, that ultimately in some ways derailed me from the project again, but led to the exhibition. The email was from Martino Stierli, then the newly installed chief curator of architecture design at the MoMA, who was exploring the possible topics for his first exhibition as the chief curator at the MoMA. And then for a variety of reasons, he thought that maybe Yugoslavia could be a good topic for that. Of course, he's Swiss by origin, so geographically he was much closer. There's of course a large ex-Yugoslav diaspora in Switzerland, but from sometime in the early mid 2000s, there was also this fascination with former Yugoslavia among Swiss architects, especially academics based in ETH Zurich and a couple other institutions, who have been sending their studios to the former Yugoslavia and the various parts of the country for years by that time. So that kind of awareness that there was something worth studying there in kind of very interesting ways was brewing in Switzerland at the time. Of course, Martino wrote to me to ask whether I think there's even, whether this was a viable topic at all. He reached out to other people as well, and it turned out that he could not avoid this network that we had already built for Unfinished Modernizations. And ultimately, that ended up being the team, the massive team that worked on the exhibition that you see here listed on the slide on the screen. For the following 3 years, between 2015 and 2018, I pretty much dedicated all my efforts, besides regular teaching at school, to working on the show. And the biggest challenge of the show, in some ways, ended up being how to avoid the pitfalls of the superficial interpretations that I just described, and to me, in some ways, how to marry those two motivations that I mentioned at the beginning. How to assert the architectural value of the buildings that we want to show, while still also trying to enlighten the audience about their social purpose, about the larger social project, and also to offer some kind of a more sophisticated view of the society that would not pander to the stereotypes, especially to American audience, right? To the audience in New York that would be greatly unfamiliar with the context, right? In Europe, it probably would have been easier, would require less explanation, but in the States, because of the distance, simply geographical, but also temporal distance, this kind of explanation of the wider context and the social purpose of architecture became especially important. And we, mulled over these questions for a while. I already had to deal with sort of structuring books and projects about Yugoslavia twice before, right? Both for Modernism In-Between and for Unfinished Modernizations. So this was an exercise of trying to organize everything for a third time, and hopefully in a different way. And eventually we structured the exhibition into four large sections that talked about modernization of society under a socialist state. And by that we meant several different ways in which architecture participated in modernization, through mass urbanization, through technological modernization, as well as the construction of a new infrastructure, of social infrastructure, civic and welfare buildings, schools, museums, libraries, etc. That is the gray area that you see on the screen. As a second defining feature of Yugoslav history, we saw its geopolitical positioning. So we looked at the global networks that emerged especially through non-alignment. We looked at the exchanges of architecture through the lens of the construction company Energoprojekt that exported architecture to the non-aligned world. We looked at the reconstruction of Skopje as this massively, after the 1963 earthquake, as a massively internationalized effort that also had kind of a high symbolic charge in terms of Yugoslavia's balancing between the East and West. We looked at mass tourism as a way of hosting foreigners, again, both from Eastern and Western Europe. And finally, we looked at the exhibition pavilions at various world's fairs. The third section was about everyday life, right? In some ways, that stereotypical image of socialist architecture is usually through the lens of prefabricated buildings and neighborhoods, and we try to address that by offering a more nuanced argument that also included design. Industrial design of everyday objects, commercial buildings, etc. And the final section that you see in this olive green color were identities. The question of ethnic composition of Yugoslavia and this balance between centrifugal and centripetal forces that held the country in place, individual ethnic identities as expressed through various national schools in Slovenia or Bosnia, etc. But also, and this is where we ended the exhibition, the monuments to anti-fascist struggle that in some ways produced this invisible network of sites that held the country together, right? The liberation war was in some ways the basis of the legitimacy for the system, and we ended the show by looking at war memorials. So just to help you to orient yourselves, you got up to the third floor, and I'm not sure whether it's possible to see my cursor. You probably don't.
No, we see your cursor, actually.
Oh, you do? Okay,
yeah,
excellent.
We do. Okay.
So you enter here up this the so-called Bauhaus stairs at the MoMA, and you enter the exhibition here, and you pass through these four sections, right? Going through modernization, global networks, everyday life, and then finally exit at the end. The exhibition started on a very, in some ways, optimistic note with a video installation that I'm going to show you a bit later that talks about the enthusiasm of mass reconstruction after the war, and then it ended on a rather melancholy note with the monuments, many of which were damaged or destroyed or left to decay. And in some ways, in that way, we try to tell this story of the chronology of Yugoslavia as well. So this was about framing this wider political context, but we also inserted several moments in the exhibition that spoke to MoMA's sort of canonizing purpose, right? MoMA is in some ways, that was one of the challenges, right? MoMA is the institution that for the past 100 years that it has existed, almost 100, it has canonized architects and movements, right? And it worked towards establishing what counts as valuable architecture. So in that sense, I thought it would be kind of an interesting provocation, and Martino sort of agreed. We included 4 small so-called monographic rooms dedicated to 4 prominent architects: Bogdan Bogdanović, Juraj Neidhardt, Edvard Ravnikar, and Vjenceslav Richter, each of whom very closely related to one of these larger political topics that we try to address, but also who developed, in this case, they're all men, right? His own strong, very specific aesthetic and ethical position that we tried to highlight. So in a way, this was sort of a comment, right, or how do I put it? A response to MoMA's canonizing role, offering sort of the audience a little bit of that canonizing tradition that the institution cultivated for the past 100 years, by offering 4 names that had never been included in that canon before. In some ways, when I proposed these 4 names, I had an idea that the material would be possible to find for 3 of them, because their archives have been housed properly in different institutions in the region and elsewhere. Bogdanović's work is all at the Architectural Center in Vienna. Huge amount of original drawings. So we knew that was available. Ravnikar's work is at the Museum of Architecture and Design in Ljubljana, also beautifully cataloged and available. Some of it is with his family, but we also knew that was available too. Richter's work is a part of his collection at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Zagreb. So again, that was available. The biggest gamble was the 4th one, Juraj Neidhardt, the Bosnian architect, who in 1957 published, together with his Slovenian colleague Dušan Grabrian, this groundbreaking, beautiful, massive book, Architecture of Bosnia and the Way to Modernity, for which Le Corbusier wrote a preface. And I thought that it would be really valuable to sort of expose the audience to this book, both as an argument and as an object, as a beautifully designed object. However, we had no idea whether there was any archival material that we could find. And this is about, I want to raise that kind of now the first major practical challenge we encountered, which is about supporting the exhibition through the archival material. Of course, as you know, what happened in Bosnia in the 90s, what happened in Sarajevo in the 90s was the siege, right? Was the incredible destruction, and it was it was actually rather miraculous that anything of this original material survived. When we showed up in Sarajevo in the summer of 2016, we were greeted at the Academy of Sciences and Arts, where several prominent architects were members. And when we showed up there, they also introduced us to Neidhardt's daughter, who brought to the Academy 3 books of her father's materials that were all laid out, as you can see in the image on the left. This was perhaps the biggest surprise that we encountered during this research trip. I knew the book very well. I wrote about it. I presented about it, but I never could imagine that any of the original drawings would have survived. And that was perhaps the most emotional moment in the entire process. I'm kind of I'm actually not embarrassed to admit that I literally choked when I saw the wealth of the material that greeted us there, and that ended up being perhaps to me one of my favorite moments in the exhibition that we laid out in this. Oops, sorry, I'm making a mess. Room dedicated completely to Neidhart's work and this book. I'll show you later how it was laid out in space. In some other instances, we knew again that there would be some spectacular objects to display. For example, Kenzo Tange's model of downtown Skopje, after the reconstruction of the downtown after the earthquake. But Skopje ended up being another of those places where access to the archives was hugely problematic. And what saved us there was the advocacy of our Macedonian colleagues, Anna Ivanovska and Vladimir Deskov and Anna's brother Jovan Ivanovski, etc., who have for years collected the material from the architects and also from the disbanded offices, privatized architectural offices and construction companies, and literally saved them from being thrown into trash. I call this their efforts, I think really deserve to be called some kind of guerrilla preservation, right? Because they're completely outside of the institutional framework, and yet they are producing, doing work that actually the state should be conducting, but they're doing it completely on individual basis. So this was a second major challenge in terms of acquiring archival material. In the end, the Skopje room was one of the most striking and best supported through original works, original drawings and models, but it was largely due to these individual activist efforts that were outside of the institutions. Another interesting issue was the question of the famous kiosk that you see on the screen, that was designed by the Slovenian architect Saša Mehtig, produced some 7,000 copies, was all over former Yugoslavia, exported to much of Eastern Europe. That MoMA originally had in their archives. Mehtig was extremely conscious of the need to promote his own work. So he actually donated an early model, an early prototype to MoMA in the early 1970s. And then as we were developing the exhibition, it was discovered that original kiosk was missing. No one knew where it was. So we ended up on a mission. Martino and I went on a mission to Ljubljana to look for an extant copy of the kiosk that could be brought to New York to be exhibited and also brought back to the permanent collection of the MoMA. That in itself ended up being kind of a very interesting process, because we toured the periphery of Ljubljana, various factories, car washes, etc., that hamburger stands that still had this kiosk, and finally found one that was shipped to Brooklyn. Of course, even the shipping cost was much higher than what purchasing of the kiosk cost. And then it was restored meticulously in this super high-end facility in Brooklyn that specializes in painting of artworks. They stripped this green paint that was added on the kiosk afterwards, and repainted the kiosk with this high-end paint that's used for Ferraris, supposedly, and perfectly matching the original tone. So the meticulousness of the process, right, in some ways was in sharp contrast with the original state of the kiosk that was sort of forgotten somewhere on the periphery of Ljubljana, which again is kind of an interesting angle to this question of preservation, right, of architectural heritage that MoMA instituted. In many instances, however, we actually had to produce new models because original models of the buildings did not exist. There were some that we were able to show. And so we worked with students at Cooper Union, at then my school at Florida Atlantic University, to produce a range of new models, some of which you see on the screen. These are from Cooper Union, and then these were from, this one was from FAU, the model of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Belgrade. In many instances, we had to deal with archives that were, when they existed, they were not really always properly organized. One of the standout projects, the Poljud Stadium in Split, that you see here on the left, we had the new model produced in the forefront, but in the back you see the beautiful, absolutely stunning original drawings that, however, were, we sort of browsed through piles of papers until we could find the proper ones, right? The standard simply of archiving in the region or still lacking in many places, even where any kind of archiving exists. And a lot of the stuff that we encountered was damaged by water, by torn, etc. So that was yet another form of challenge. And of course, a final one was that in some places there were archives, but they were not collecting properly architectural materials, right? So in Serbia, for example, we could find the drawings for many of the buildings that we wanted to show. They existed at, for example, the archive of the city of Belgrade, but there were blueprints, right? Not the original archival, not the original drawings that MoMA wants to show as sort of artworks in their own right. So that posed yet another challenge, and we ended up not showing we ended up showing these blueprints as facsimiles, right? That were only digitized and reprinted in New York. And finally, a lot of the work was really primary archival research of going to architecture offices, architects, meeting architects in person and seeing what they had left in their own personal archives. Some people were meticulous about preserving their own stuff, but many others were in some ways kind of strangely oblivious to the value of their own work and to the need to preserve it. So it was also very much a hit or a miss. I'm going to very quickly walk you now through the exhibition for 5 minutes, because I know we're already at 1 o'clock and I don't want to extend this way too long. So I'm just going to quickly walk through and show you the space. This is the entrance, Mila Turalić's 3-channel new video installation that brought back to life the efforts at post-war reconstruction and urbanization. It went with its own sound that reverberated through the entire gallery with the collage of music and sound effects that related to the scenes that you see on the screen. Here we are at the modernization section. We looked at large-scale urbanization through these enormous master plans, regional plans, etc. We looked at technological modernization by looking at TV towers, trade fair buildings, stadiums, skyscrapers, etc. Here's one of them. the Polju Stadium that Jay just described. The next section was the one on social infrastructure, where we looked at civic buildings and welfare buildings like the libraries. This is the National Library of Kosovo in Pristina, which in some ways was at the heart of kind of the spatial center of the exhibition, because it spoke to so many different questions raised in the exhibition. The symbol, the current symbol, architectural symbol of Kosovo, being the library, not a very common situation that a cultural institution like that acquires such prominence as an icon of the entire state in the region. Here we see its position towards the section about identities, because it was a deliberate identity statement with these references to Byzantine and Islamic architecture, right, as a kind of common denominator for multi-confessional, multi-ethnic makeup of Kosovo. We looked at various cultural institutions, museums, schools, workers' universities, hospitals, etc. Then the global networks section. This is the Energo Project office and its exports to specifically to Nigeria. I'm singling this out because Danilo is here, who worked with them in Nigeria at the time on the series of regional plans for Kano State, which we had exhibited. The company also produced the iconic trade fair in Lagos that in many ways still organizes the urban fabric of the city. Of course, it no longer works as a fair, but is infilled with new fabric. And we also tried to highlight the role of Milica Šterić, the founding director of the architecture office at the Energo Project, whom we see here in discussion with clients from Nigeria in the 1960s. And to me, this is one of the most telling photos that we deliberately showed large enough to be visible. You can see it here because it subverts so many hierarchies that we assume when talking about architecture. So we have a black man and a woman discussing, kind of doing business, right? Discussing the project with three white men standing around and listening to them. The role of women was also something that we highlighted, and besides Šterić, we also highlighted the work of Montenegrin architect Kana Radović, who now finally this year had a show, a one-woman show in Venice at the Biennale, which was very, very well received by the media. There was even a review of her work in New York Review of Books recently, and I'm kind of very proud that we actually showed her work internationally for the first time in the MoMA exhibition. We looked at Skopje. This is the room with this concrete baroque of Skopje, if you want. There are some of this is a newly produced model, as well as the original model of the opera house, the Macedonian opera and ballet, something that anticipates Zaha Hadid by 20 years. We looked at Wenceslav Richter and his exhibition pavilions. Actually, Chris and Mary hosted a symposium at UT a very long time ago. I don't even remember the year, where I presented my research on Richter for the first time, and his design for the pavilion of Yugoslavia at Brussels Expo that you see here in the middle of the slide. Here it is. And his other work, utopian projects like synthetic urbanism that you see on the screen. We looked at, in this darkened room to the left, we showed tourism facilities, an archive of tourism photos. There was a commercial company called Commerce, which took photos to be used as postcards. So we got access to that, and we showed hotels on the Adriatic coast as a slideshow, sort of trying to evoke that creating this immersive environment, trying to evoke the experience of sitting in your aunt's living room and watching slides from the vacations. But these were the slides that we showed, like the hotel in Malinska on Krk, or Libertas Hotel in Dubrovnik that you see on the screen here. We looked at everyday life, as I mentioned. Here we see the entrance and the layout of the room with these industrial design objects, furniture, this iconic chair by Niko Kralj that was produced in literally hundreds of thousands of copies, exported both to Eastern and Western Europe. Supposedly it was copied without license in the Soviet Union, and a few million copies were produced there as well. MoMA now MoMA store now sells the reissued version of the chair that is not cheap. It's, I think, costs now some $400. At the time, it was meant to be cheap, industrialized, affordable, good design for the people. And I remember it being at every institution that you would enter. So again, ironies of canonization of design are obvious in this case. Here's another view. Some of the objects are already in the MoMA collection, like this poster, which had been in for the Biennale of Design in Ljubljana, which had been in the collection for decades, I actually think. We looked at large-scale residential complexes, a split 3 being one of them, going directly against the stereotypes of endlessly monotonous, prefabricated, soulless neighborhoods. This is an utterly modernist neighborhood on the coast, but that builds on the grid of the Diocletian's palace, with pedestrian streets paved with stone, etc., right? Merging the modern and traditional in a really, really interesting way. We looked at design of apartments, especially in Belgrade, the so-called Belgrade School, which experimented with efficient functionalist apartment plans, but that married functionalism with the ideas of open plan to produce apartments that feel and appear much larger than they are. This was just an illustration of the tremendous amount of effort that went into designing the interiors of housing. This is stand in sharp contrast to much of standardized and typified architecture in the rest of Eastern Europe, where identical buildings were replicated throughout the country, right? The great example is the Soviet Union, but so is Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia actually standardized apartments to a great deal. In Yugoslavia, that was sort of turned on its head, where apartments became recognizable, but in no way standardized. Even the same neighborhood would have tremendous diversity in terms of layouts of different apartments, and we tried to show that as well. And in some instances, like here on the right, architects went after the completion of the buildings and worked with inhabitants to adapt, to customize the apartments to different types of families. So here we see the drawings by Milenia Marušić, the Belgrade architect, who went and, each of these plans that you see on the left here also has the names of inhabitants, the family structure, the phone numbers, and the proposals that she made to the inhabitants on how to adapt their apartment to their specific needs. And then finally, this is a section on identities. I am super proud that we have that we were able to get this model for the Parliament of Slovenia by Jože Plečnik, which actually does belong to the socialist period because it was produced after World War II. And it sort of served as the introduction into this topic that, in contrast to pre-war Yugoslavia, which was meant to sort of coalesce into some kind of unified single entity, socialist Yugoslavia was a composite of six republics, each with their own capital and school of architecture, and in many ways each with their own architectural culture that was cultivated in some ways differently in every place. Following Plečnik's model, we went to the first of the remaining monographic rooms and looked at Edvard Ravnikar, Plečnik's own student, who himself educated a huge number of architects. So this lineage from Otto Wagner at the turn of the 19th century to Plečnik to Ravnikar's students is kind of arguably the marker of Slovenian architectural identity, right? There's not much symbolism that makes it Slovenian, but it's this lineage of education that makes this culture very clearly rooted in its place. And here we see in the photo the Republic Square, right? The central square of Ljubljana, in some ways the central civic space of Slovenia, designed by Ravnikar. And here in the forefront, the work of his own students. We looked at various original drawings. We showed them here on various scales. Then we continued with the question of identities. Here's that gap that bridges towards the library in Pristina, right, as another kind of identity statement. Then we are here in the room dedicated to Juraj Neidhardt. This is the book, Architecture of Bosnia and the Way to Modernity, that I mentioned. And then the original drawings, most of them produced for the book, including some original printing cliches that we found. Neidhardt's own student, Zlatko Ugljen, his work was exhibited outside. His great groundbreaking mosque in Visoko was the centerpiece of this section. We see it here in this large photo, but we also had the original model here that we got from the architect. Here is the original section of the building, which shows how this fundamentally modernist building sort of both hints at the pyramidal composition of Ottoman mosques, but also involves this very Corbusian skylights that correlate with the 5 daily prayers in Islam. And then the final section were the monuments. This is a map of anti-fascist monuments across Yugoslavia that we had at the beginning of this section to highlight the enormousness of the production, but also to show how this production gave rise to a field of experimentation that produced some of these iconic structures that you now see in mass media and on social networks. And we actually got some original models of these buildings and sculptures, including the Sutjeska model here, Kozara. This is Petrova Gora. This is the Kolashin Memorial Center, right, in Montenegro. So it was possible to actually show some of the original material there as well. Yeah, this is Macedonium, so-called Macedonium, the monument to the uprising in 1903 for independence. And so we were able to talk about that too. The labels also made an effort to also point out the original commemorative purpose, right? Not to observe the monuments merely as these disembodied forms, but also to anchor the meaning of commemoration to the original historical events to which they were tied. Again, Petrogora, you see it now in its abandoned state. Current, as another kind of continuing the direction of orientalization, this monument has been one of the sites for a German sci-fi show on Netflix recently that was released, I think, earlier this year. So the original commemorative purpose is still being challenged, but that's in this particular case, it's also the result of specific political problems, right? There's always a clear political dimension there. We finally finished with Bogdan Bogdanovic and the entire room of his own drawings, as well his own original photos of his work that we found in the archives as well. And that is the end of the exhibition. What is the outcome? Finally, just a couple of minutes. Well, one of the outcomes is that, for example, the red kiosk is now all over the place. There is now one at Times Square in New York that serves as a DJ booth. And that's not the one that that MoMA bought, but it has emerged as an icon. There's now one in Vienna, in downtown Vienna. There's another one in Berlin. So in a way, it became established as a design icon of the period that has gained global visibility. Numerous other books and projects have emerged in the meantime. I've been on a number of dissertation committees now dealing with Yugoslavia at different institutions, both in the States and in Europe. The interest is absolutely there. Perhaps the most important and the most still challenging effect is still sort of related to the region and the political situation there, where the broad public, I think, has started changing a view of the architectural heritage of the period. The profession absolutely has changed. I think that among architects, there is now kind of a firmly established opinion that this is a valuable heritage. But nevertheless, in the political perception, the political attitudes, right, or the attitudes of the political establishment are still hugely problematic. At the time when the exhibition opened, there was a kind of really problematic situation with one of the memorial centers in Montenegro, in Nikšić, which the local government was trying to tear down, even though we highlighted in the exhibition catalog. And just to illustrate how this challenge to this heritage coming from the political context still continues. Just the other day, there was the news in Serbian media that the government wants to demolish almost the entire Belgrade Fair and preserve only a couple of buildings to be converted into restaurants, right? Which is pretty scandalous idea, considering that some of those key pavilions were absolute cutting edge aesthetic as well as engineering achievements of the late 1950s. Hall 1 of the Belgrade Fair was the largest dome in the world at the time, etc. And yet that is completely overlooked by a political establishment. Speaking of canon, in some ways, I can say that we're also got canonized. Had someone told me that when I was a student 30 years ago, when I used Kenneth Frampton's Modern Architecture as a textbook, that 30 years later there would be a chapter on Yugoslavia, I probably wouldn't have believed, but here it is. So in some ways we became canonized, as much as I don't think that canons should exist in the first place. At least they provide some sense of memory, right, for the architecture that in many ways continues to be challenged. It's already 1:20. I know that I've gone way over time, and I want to thank you for your attention. And I'm here to answer any questions.
So Vladimir, I'm glad you went over time, because there's not a single minute of that I would have cut from your talk. It was absolutely riveting. Amazing. I wish I could have seen the exhibition in person, but I feel like I was able to see so much of it, and like even better having you sort of narrate it for us and talk about the whole process. But I also love how you put it in the context of your own, kind of the last couple of decades, your own sort of path and the changes in the field, which sounds like more still need to be made, but it's clear you've made a big impact. So congratulations. I mean,
no, thank you.
that is an amazing achievement. I am so impressed by, wow, every part of that, all the stuff you were able to bring together. That's just absolutely amazing.
No, thank you. Thank you. Okay.
I just want to make sure if anyone else has questions, though, we can have a little tiny bit of time for questions. I'm gonna see if anyone else
Actually,
raises their hand. Yes.
there is a question from Stephen about biography of Zoran. There is actually a book there was an exhibition about Bojovic maybe some 5 years ago that Dubravka Sekulic curated, and there's a book that came out as a result of that. It's called 3 Points of Support? 3 tačke oslonca. 3 Points of Support. It's bilingual. I don't exactly remember the English translation, but it is available. But I do think that it probably deserves kind of a more thorough look into it. But also Danilo's role in the same projects, I think, needs to be mentioned and highlighted.
Yes, Danilo's doing a lot of the same work for Soviet architecture. So that's both of you are trailblazers.
I meant Danilo as a participant in those.
Oh,
projects.
in this actual project.
Yes,
oh,
Danilo
I didn't know
was
that.
in Nigeria with Bojovic at the time.
Oh, in that project, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes. So I see that Vlad Baronia has a question. Vlad, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay, yeah.
You're muted.
Thanks. Thank you, Vladimir, for this really wonderful presentation. And I got to see the show in New York, and it was, it was like one of those really rare experiences where you thought this could never have happened, and then it did, and it was just very, it was like a very touching experience, not just sort of educational. So yeah, thank you for that work. I have one question that's more sort of related to the actual sort of exhibition of architecture, and then just sort of, I guess, a factual question. So the first one is, I'm wondering, how did you go about choosing the photographs? And I know that Valentin Jack his photographs are featured mostly in the catalog and also in the exhibit. And so I'm wondering, did you have any role in kind of directing the photography there? And what were kind of the parameters around that? Part of it is because, I think the photographs are actually very similar to Jan Kempenauer's, which, you've called out as sort of problematic. And so I'm wondering kind of what role did curators have in that process, and, what part did the institution have? And then my sort of factual question is, so I think the most touching part of the exhibit for me was the Juraj Neidhardt, because I hadn't really known about him, and it was just like something that was so special and unique. And so I'm just wondering if what happened to his archive after the show was, dismantled. Did it actually find kind of a home somewhere in Bosnia specifically? So yeah, thank you for answering these questions.
Yeah, thank you for the questions. They're, great questions and good eye. I think my biggest problem with Kempenauer's is not so much the photos. It's really what goes around them. It's the interpretations and the lack of credit, right? the fact that the name attached to the photos is the photographers, and you never hear who the actual artists were. Like imagine, publishing a book about sculpture, right? And not crediting, I don't know, Rodin, right? It just does not work that way. But I do think that photos have agency as well, right? And so I'll be blunt. Yek was not my choice. Yek was hired by MoMA, and we actually that was a contentious moment, but it was non-negotiable, and it's I couldn't. That was not something that I could avoid. If you look at my first book with Wolfgang Thaler, you will see that the photos are very different. And Thaler's photos are bring the sense of life, right? That and the sense that these buildings are very much still the living infrastructure of the cities across Yugoslavia. Yek's photos are more about this gloomy commemoration, right? I mean, a lot of reviews of the exhibition highlighted that and kind of said, come on, like what, we're talking about Mediterranean country, right? And everything is gray and dark, as if it's Scandinavia. So it's, that it is what it is, right? There's all kinds of different types of politics related to that. So it's, a project that involves many different people. So that's the answer. To go to Neidhart. Yes, Neidhart, as I try to explain, Neidhart's moment to me was the most emotionally touching moment when we discovered that miraculous archive of his work. His daughter is still alive. And she had those boxes with her. They were, however, really saved in, again, a miraculous way when some Dutch journalist, I think during the war, during the siege, somehow managed to get them out of their house. And I don't even remember whether he took them to the Netherlands or they were rather miraculously saved, right? Unlike much of the archival material in Bosnia, right? That, not to mention, the library that was bombed and burned. What happened is that MoMA offered to acquire part of the collection. So some objects were acquired for the permanent collection of the MoMA, but I think that the rest is now hopefully finding home. It should find home with the Academy of Sciences and Arts in Sarajevo. And I think that Tanja Neidhart's gift, I think originally it was meant to be a gift, came with a compensation. And this compensation, the daughter is now using to reissue the book. So there's going to be the new edition. Yeah. Thanks precisely to the situation that it was exhibited in MoMA and that MoMA acquired some of it.
It looks like there is one question in the chat, but then Chris has a question too. So let me maybe you can quickly answer this one in the chat. Do you see that as comparing Yugoslavia with the larger East European and Second World context? Yeah, this is Alexander Bala's question. Do you want to address that one?
Yes, the celebration of concrete beyond its purely utilitarian purpose. Well, no doubt, right? There was I think the contrast really applies to residential architecture. That concrete in much of the rest of Eastern Europe is seen in very utilitarian terms because of prefabrication, and because of prefabrication that was absolutely relentlessly applied in Yugoslavia. There was much greater variety of prefabricated systems, and production was much more hybrid. So there would usually be prefabricated components that would be combined with other materials. When concrete was used throughout, it acquired a much more sculptural quality as well. However, and this is something that has started emerging as well, there is an entire body of, let's say, civic and welfare and other types of public architecture throughout much of Eastern Europe that has that kind of exaggerated, formal, and expressive quality. And this is something that a lot of people are now fascinated with. Whether you go to, I don't know, Armenia or Georgia or Bulgaria, right? I mean, Bulgaria is such a great example with Buzluja, and you know, we have Mary and Stefka here, so maybe I should perhaps not claim any special expertise there. But what I want to say is that even the rest of Eastern Europe is not so different when we go beyond residential architecture and we start looking at other building types. There is a lot of this expressiveness that was present there as well. And then in some instances, even in residential architecture, there are examples that I can think of, for example, from Poland, but also from Soviet Union, where even residential blocks are extremely expressive and designed with a great deal of formal ambition.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, Chris.
So a lot of my question is, first a comment, then a question. The comment is, I remember very well 20 years ago, having the discussion with you, a little more than 20 years ago, because we're now in November, of how you were going to achieve this idea of putting this kind of architecture, onto the map. And I have to say, I was a little skeptical at the time. I think you have achieved beyond your wildest dreams with some of the things that you did. But three of our PhD students are online today. So Uli from Austria, Alex, Poland, not from Poland, but who's studying Polish architecture, and Stefka, Bulgaria. And I guess what I would ask you to do is to give those three advice about how they push through with topics that are, I don't want to use the word secondary because it's the wrong word, but topics that are seen today to be peripheral.
Oh, I'm perhaps the last person to give advice. Well, in part, right? I mean, MoMA was not within my agency, right?
No, that's true. It fell into your lap. I mean,
it fell into my lap. It fell into my lap for a reason.
Yeah.
You know, because there was the previous work done, but still, it was not something that could have been planned. And I always sort of chastise myself for my lack of focus and sort of being allowed to be led by different interests. So had it been to, you know, had I planned my career more carefully, I don't know, maybe I'm not sure whether I would have ended up doing it. So it was a bit of a fluke. That said, I think it's to me, I think what worked in favor ultimately of all of this is to allow your kind of instinct about what matters to you to eventually gain expression.
Yeah. Have faith in yourself.
I could have been, you know, I probably should have been a lot more focused in finishing this book about geopolitics, but then there were also these other arguments that I was trying to make, and I'm still struggling with that conundrum, right? I do want to write and I am working slowly towards the book that is going to theorize the relationship between architecture and geopolitics in the Cold War through the lens of Yugoslavia. But then I also know that there's so much of architecture that was produced there that is still lacking interpretation. Some really fantastic buildings that that really challenge, the wider constructs of architecture history, right? What are the key moments? What are the key achievements that still have not received the proper theorization in purely architectural terms, right? For example, the questions of space, and Chris is such a great person to talk about that with, right? Because he's written about that in the context of Vienna. I actually do think that Yugoslavia, and specifically the context of Belgrade, produced some really fundamental new knowledge about space, architectural space, and yet that has never been properly theorized. I'm kind of constantly pulled in these different directions, simply because there is so much potential, right, to get out of it. So I don't know whether, just allow your instincts to lead you, even if they're if it may sound like a detour. I mean, this is the worst advice to give to graduate students, but
No, not really. Not really.
Oh, it's great. It's great.
Not really.
Follow your passions.
Follow
Follow your instincts.
Follow your instincts.
It
Follow your,
worked for Vladimir. It'll work for you.
work for me too.
Well,
So,
thank you so much for this. We're all so proud of you, and we're all fans, and we'll be following your work. So thank you for coming today.
thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone for coming. It's so great seeing all of the familiar faces. I feel a little bit closer, even though we're physically distant.
hvala na svemu, and come soon for a taco.
And likewise, I mean, I want good food too.
We've got good tacos up there too. Well, and thank you, everyone. Thank you everyone for coming, and we will see you next week in Balkan Circle.